The telephone rang at 23 minutes past midnight. Major Friedrich von der Heydt reached across his desk in the farmhouse headquarters of the 6th Parachute Regiment, his hand steady despite the hour. Outside, the June night lay thick and humid over the Cotentin Peninsula, the kind of darkness that swallowed sound. He lifted the receiver. "Herr Major," the voice belonged to Oberleutnant Grassmeyer, calling from the coastal observation post near St. Meric-Lys. "We're hearing aircraft. Many aircraft." Von der Heydt paused. Allied bombers had been active for weeks, pounding the French coast in preparation for an invasion everyone knew was coming. But something in Grassmeyer's voice carried an edge the Major had learned to recognize during 4 years of war, the timbre of a man whose training had suddenly collided with something his instructors never prepared him for. "How many?" "I cannot count them, sir." "The sound, it's continuous." Von der Heydt stood, moving to the window. Through the blackout curtains, he could hear it now, a low, building drone that seemed to come from everywhere at once, as if the sky itself had developed a voice. He checked his watch, 0024 hours, the 6th of June, 1944. The invasion, when it came, would arrive by sea. Everyone knew this. The Atlantic Wall, that vast chain of fortifications stretching from Norway to Spain, existed for one purpose: to stop an amphibious assault. The Luftwaffe's reconnaissance, limited though it had become, watched the English Channel. The Kriegsmarine's remaining vessels patrolled the approaches. Field Marshal Rommel himself had spent months reinforcing the beaches, planting millions of obstacles in the tidal zones, training his men for the moment when Allied landing craft would appear on the horizon. "Grassmeyer," von der Heydt said into the telephone, "are you certain these are not simply bombers passing overhead?" The young officer's reply came after a pause, and in that silence, the Major heard something that would replay in his memory for decades: the soft pop of a distant explosion, then another, and another, like champagne corks at a celebration no one had been invited to attend. "Sir," Grassmeyer said, his voice now stripped of its usual military composure, "the sky is full of parachutes. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today." Von der Heydt dropped the receiver. He was already moving toward the door, shouting orders to his adjutant, when the first reports began flooding in from observation posts across the sector. Parachutists. Hundreds of them. Perhaps thousands. Descending through the darkness onto French soil, behind the beach defenses, behind the coastal artillery positions, behind everything the German army had built to stop the Allied invasion that was supposed to arrive from the sea. The Major was himself a parachutist, one of Germany's most experienced. He had jumped over Crete in 1941, had watched his regiment bleed into the Mediterranean dust while capturing that island from British and Commonwealth forces. He understood airborne operations better than most men in the Wehrmacht, understood their limitations, and their terrible cost. After Crete, Hitler himself had declared that the age of the parachute assault had ended. Too many casualties. Too much chaos. Too vulnerable during the descent and immediately after landing, when men were scattered, disorganized, easy targets for any defender who kept his nerve. And yet now, in the first hours of the 6th of June, Friedrich von der Heydt stood in a Norman farmyard and watched what appeared to be an impossible thing: parachutes falling from the sky in such numbers that his mind struggled to process what his eyes reported. White canopies in the moonlight, drifting down like snow in summer. Dozens visible from where he stood. How many more beyond his field of vision? He had trained for beach defense. His regiment, the 6th Parachute, held positions inland from Utah Beach, ready to counterattack when, if, the Allies managed to breach the coastal fortifications. Their role was clear: contain any breakthrough, push the invaders back into the sea before they could establish a foothold. But this was something different. The battle was already behind them, above them, around them. Von der Heydt's regiment began deploying in the darkness, moving through hedgerow country toward the sound of gunfire that now erupted from multiple directions. The Norman bocage, that maze of ancient fields divided by earthen banks and thick hedges, transformed familiar terrain into a nightmare of limited visibility and ambush points. His men, elite paratroopers who had fought in Russia and Italy, moved with the caution of veterans who understood that confidence kills as efficiently as bullets. But they were fewer than 2,000 strong, spread across multiple positions. And if the reports filtering in were even partially accurate, they faced an enemy force that had just landed thousands of men in a single night. An enemy whose commanders had apparently learned nothing from the Crete disaster. Or perhaps, and this thought settled cold in von der Heyd's stomach, they had learned everything from it. The German military mind, in the summer of 1944, operated within certain assumptions. These were not arbitrary beliefs but conclusions drawn from years of combat experience, from tactical doctrine refined through the conquest of Poland, France, the Balkans, and the initial phases of the Russian campaign. Airborne operations, in this framework, occupied a specific niche: small-scale insertions, coup de main assaults against critical objectives, operations measured in hundreds of men rather than thousands. The Fallschirmjäger, Germany's own parachute infantry, had proven the concept's viability in the early war years. They had seized the Belgian fort of Ebenemael in 1940, had jumped into the Netherlands, and had captured the Corinth Canal in Greece. But Crete had revealed the operation's fatal flaw. When you dropped large numbers of men from aircraft, you lost control. They scattered. They landed in the wrong places. They lost equipment. And during those first critical minutes on the ground, when paratroopers were most vulnerable, a determined defender could slaughter them. General Kurt Student, who commanded the Crete operation, had watched his 7th Air Division suffer casualties approaching 40%. Nearly 4,000 dead in a single week. Hitler, reviewing the butcher's bill, had concluded that surprise alone could not overcome the fundamental vulnerability of men dangling from parachutes. After Crete, German airborne forces fought primarily as elite infantry, their specialized training preserved for small-scale operations that matched their capabilities to achievable objectives. This assessment seemed to find confirmation in the Allies' own experience. Their airborne assaults in Sicily and Italy, in 1943, had been marked by dispersion, confusion, and heavy losses. British gliders crashed into the Mediterranean. American paratroopers scattered across dozens of miles of Sicilian countryside. The operations achieved some objectives, certainly, but at a cost that appeared to validate the German conclusion: large-scale airborne assault was a tactical dead end, a weapon too blunt for modern warfare's precision requirements. Von der Heydt knew these lessons intimately. He had studied the after-action reports, and had discussed airborne operations with Student himself. The mathematics were clear. A C-47 transport could carry 18 paratroopers. To drop 1,000 men required 56 aircraft. To drop 10,000 required over 500 aircraft, flying in formation, approaching the drop zone at low speed and altitude, vulnerable to anti-aircraft fire. The logistics alone seemed prohibitive. The casualties, assuming any defender with basic competence, would be catastrophic. Yet the intelligence reports arriving at 7th Army headquarters in the weeks before June had noted something curious: the Allies were concentrating large numbers of transport aircraft in southern England. Hundreds of them. Perhaps more than 1,000. Reconnaissance photographs showed gliders being assembled in unprecedented numbers. British horses. American Wacos. The Germans noted these preparations but interpreted them through the lens of their own experience. A diversionary attack, perhaps. A demonstration to draw defenders away from the main invasion beaches. Certainly nothing that would match the scale suggested by the aircraft concentrations. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commanding Army Group B responsible for the defense of northern France, held a different view. He had studied Allied logistics, and had watched American industrial output during his North African campaign. Rommel understood that the United States could afford casualties that would cripple a European power. They could afford to waste aircraft, waste men, waste entire operations in pursuit of strategic objectives. But even Rommel, departing France on the 4th of June to celebrate his wife's birthday in Germany, did not anticipate the scale of what was coming. The German defenders expected an invasion. They expected airborne operations as part of that invasion. What they did not expect, what their training, doctrine, and experience had not prepared them for was the willingness to commit airborne forces in numbers that defied every tactical lesson learned since Crete. Major von der Haidt, moving through the darkness towards St. Mary-Glise, understood that something fundamental had shifted in the nature of warfare. The sound of aircraft overhead continued, wave after wave, the drone building and fading and building again. His men reported parachutes everywhere, in the fields, in the marshes, tangled in the hedgerows and hanging from the ancient Norman trees. Many landed kilometers from their intended drop zones, just as doctrine predicted. But there were so many of them that it no longer mattered. The mathematics had changed. If you dropped 100 paratroopers and 70 survived the landing, you had 70 scattered, disorganized men. If you dropped 10,000 and 7,000 survived, you had an army. Von der Haidt's first encounter with these airborne forces occurred at approximately 0230 hours, when a patrol from his regiment's 1st Battalion stumbled into a group of American paratroopers assembling in a field near the village of Neuville-aux-Plaines. The firefight lasted perhaps 10 minutes, ending when the Americans withdrew into the bocage. His men counted 3 enemy dead, identified them from their patches as members of the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment, part of the American 82nd Airborne Division. The 82nd. Von der Haidt knew this unit from intelligence briefs. They had fought in Sicily and Italy, had taken casualties, had performed adequately but not impressively. Now they were here, in France, thousands of kilometers from their previous battlefields, falling from the sky in numbers that suggested either supreme confidence or reckless desperation. More reports arrived. The 101st Airborne Division, another American formation, had landed farther south, near the coastal causeways leading inland from Utah Beach. British paratroopers, identified by their distinctive helmets and red berets, had seized bridges over the Orne River and the King Canal to the east. The drops were not limited to a single objective or a narrow front. They extended across dozens of kilometers, creating a zone of chaos behind the coastal defenses. By 0300 hours, von der Haidt understood that his mission had transformed from counterattacking a beach landing to containing an enemy already behind German lines. His regiment began engaging American paratroopers throughout the sector, small actions in the darkness, firefights that flared and died as both sides probed for position. The Americans, despite their dispersion, fought with the confidence of men who understood their role in a larger plan. They did not defend and wait for relief. They attacked. This was the detail that disturbed von der Haidt most. Airborne troops, by doctrine, should consolidate defensive positions after landing and await link-up with the main invasion force. But these Americans moved aggressively through the Norman countryside, seizing crossroads, cutting telephone lines, establishing blocking positions on roads the Germans needed for reinforcement. They behaved like men who knew reinforcements were coming, who simply needed to hold long enough for an amphibious force to break through the beach defenses and link up with them. Which meant the beach landings were coming. Soon. Perhaps at dawn. The Major returned to his headquarters at 0415 hours to find his situation maps covered in red markings indicating enemy contact. His regiment had engaged American paratroopers in at least 15 separate locations. His intelligence officer estimated enemy strength in their sector at between 2,000 and 3,000 men, possibly more. And these were only the Americans. The British airborne forces to the east apparently numbered in the thousands as well. Von der Haidt placed a call to divisional headquarters, requesting clarification of his mission. Should his regiment continue attempting to eliminate the airborne forces, or should they reposition to defend against the anticipated beach landings? The answer, when it came, reflected the confusion spreading through the German command structure: do both. Contain the paratroopers. Be ready to counterattack the beaches. Maintain unit cohesion. Prevent enemy link-up. Impossible orders, but then, the entire situation had become impossible somewhere around midnight when the sky began disgorging thousands of enemy soldiers. The first prisoners arrived at von der Haidt's headquarters at approximately 0500 hours, 3 Americans from the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, captured near St. Mary-Glise. The Major interviewed them himself, his English adequate for basic questioning. They were young, perhaps 19 or 20 years old, and they displayed that peculiar American mixture of friendliness and defiance that von der Heydt had observed in other captured U.S. soldiers. They answered questions about their unit designations, offered name, rank and serial number, but volunteered nothing about operational plans. "How many of you jumped tonight?" von der Heydt asked. The ranking prisoner, a corporal whose name tape read Sullivan, smiled. "Enough." "Your division strength? Wouldn't you like to know?" Von der Heydt tried a different approach. "You understand that you've landed far behind our defensive positions. Your invasion fleet, when it arrives, must breach the Atlantic Wall before it can reach you. That could take days. Possibly weeks. How long can you hold?" Sullivan's smile widened. "Long enough." The interview yielded little tactical intelligence, but it confirmed what von der Heydt had begun to suspect: these men believed in their plan. They had trained for this operation, understood their role in it, and accepted the risks. They were not surprised to find themselves surrounded by German forces because being surrounded was part of the plan. Their confidence suggested that someone, somewhere in the Allied command structure, had calculated that the shock value of a massive airborne assault, the chaos it would create, the confusion it would sow, outweighed the casualties it would inevitably produce. Dawn arrived at 05:58 hours on the 6th of June, and with it came clarity that von der Heydt almost wished he could unlearn. In the gray light, his officers assembled reports from across the regiment's sector. The scope of the Allied airborne operation began to emerge from the confusion of the night, and with each new piece of information, the major's understanding of modern warfare shifted. The Americans had dropped 2 complete airborne divisions, the 82nd and the 101st, in a single night. Not companies. Not battalions. Divisions. Each division comprised 3 parachute infantry regiments, plus supporting units, artillery, engineers, medical personnel, signal troops. The authorized strength of an American airborne division stood at approximately 13,000 men. The Allies had committed over 26,000 paratroopers to the Normandy operation alone, and this figure did not include the British 6th Airborne Division operating to the east, which added another 7,000 men to the count. Von der Heydt stood before his situation map, studying the red marks that now covered the Cotentin Peninsula. His intelligence officer, Hauptmann Erich Prehn, had compiled estimates based on contact reports, prisoner interrogations, and observation. The numbers defied the assumptions that had guided German planning. "We're facing at least 12 regiments of airborne infantry," Prehn said, his voice flat with the exhaustion of a man who had not slept in 24 hours. "Possibly 15 if we include the British formations. They dropped them in approximately 3 hours, between 0100 and 0400 hours. 3 hours, von der Heydt repeated. To deliver more men than we have in this entire sector." "Yes, sir." The mathematics were staggering. The Allies had employed over 1,000 transport aircraft, C-47s, the workhorses of American military aviation, supplemented by hundreds of gliders towed behind them. Each transport made at least one trip across the English Channel, flying at altitudes between 400 and 600 meters, slow and vulnerable. Each glider carried troops or equipment, jeeps, artillery pieces, ammunition, medical supplies, everything an isolated airborne force would need to sustain combat operations until relieved by the invasion fleet. The operation represented a level of logistical commitment that von der Heydt, for all his combat experience, had never witnessed. The Luftwaffe's entire transport fleet, at this stage of the war, could not move 13,000 men in 3 hours. The Germans lacked the aircraft, lacked the pilots, lacked the fuel. What the Allies had accomplished in a single night would have required weeks of German preparation, assuming they could assemble the necessary resources at all. And then there was the philosophical question that gnawed at von der Heydt as he studied his maps: why? Why commit airborne forces on this scale when the lessons of Crete suggested it was suicide? Why risk thousands of elite troops in a form of warfare that every professional soldier agreed was too costly, too chaotic, too dependent on factors beyond command control? The answer, he began to realize, lay in the very chaos that German doctrine sought to avoid. the Allied plan did not require their paratroopers to land precisely on target. It did not require perfect execution. It required only that enough men landed close enough to their objectives to create a zone of uncertainty behind the Atlantic Wall. And in that uncertainty lay opportunity. By 0800 hours, as the first reports of naval bombardment reached von der Heyd's headquarters, the scope of Allied ambition became clear. The airborne drops were not the main invasion. They were the anvil against which the seaborne landings would hammer German defenses. The paratroopers had seized the causeways leading inland from Utah Beach, the only routes through the flooded marshlands behind the coast. They held the villages dominating those causeways. They blocked the roads German reinforcements would need to reach the beaches. Von der Heyd's regiment found itself in a position no German tactical doctrine had anticipated, surrounded by enemy forces, unable to reach the main battle, watching their defensive strategy unravel because the enemy had landed behind them before the invasion even began. The first American troops from the 4th Infantry Division began landing on Utah Beach at 0630 hours. By 0900, they had linked up with elements of the 101st Airborne Division near the coastal causeways. The link-up occurred within hours of the initial landings, not days or weeks as German planning had assumed, but hours. The seaborne and airborne forces became a unified army almost immediately, the paratroopers providing the inland security that allowed the beach forces to expand their lodgment without fear of immediate counterattack. Von der Heyd received orders at 0930 to attack towards St. Mary-Église and retake the town from American paratroopers who had captured it during the night. His regiment moved forward, advancing through the bocage toward contact. What followed was not a battle in any conventional sense but a series of vicious small-unit engagements that bled as force without producing decisive results. The Americans had landed scattered across the peninsula, yes, but this dispersion proved to be an asset rather than a liability. Von der Heyd's men could not maneuver without encountering enemy forces. A company would advance toward an objective only to take fire from paratroopers positioned in a hedgerow 300 meters away. They would clear one field and discover Americans in the next. The bocage, which should have favored the defenders, became a maze where every turn concealed a potential ambush. And the Americans fought differently than von der Heyd expected. They did not establish static defensive lines. They moved constantly, infiltrating through German positions, attacking from unexpected directions, using the terrain with an intimate knowledge that suggested extensive training in exactly this type of close-quarters combat. His men were elite paratroopers, veterans of the Eastern Front and the Mediterranean campaigns. But these Americans, these supposedly green troops from a nation with no military tradition, matched them action for action. The attack towards St. Mary-Église stalled by midday. Von der Heyd's 1st Battalion reported heavy casualties. His 2nd Battalion found its advance blocked by American positions anchored on stone buildings that had stood since the Middle Ages, structures never designed as fortifications but proving remarkably resistant to small arms fire. His 3rd Battalion encountered armored vehicles, light tanks that had arrived via glider, providing the paratroopers with mobile firepower that doctrine insisted they should not possess. By 1400 hours, von der Heyd understood that retaking St. Mary-Église would require substantial reinforcements. But reinforcements were not available. Every German unit in Normandy faced similar pressures. The invasion had struck across a 50-kilometer front, and the Allies were pouring men and material ashore at rates that overwhelmed defensive preparations. The German command structure, so efficient in conquest, proved cumbersome in crisis. Orders contradicted each other. Reserves moved toward one threat only to be redirected toward another. The vaunted German military machine, which had conquered most of Europe through speed and decisiveness, found itself paralyzed by the simultaneity of Allied attacks. Von der Heyd pulled his regiment back at 1600 hours, establishing defensive positions that aimed to contain rather than eliminate the American airborne forces. It was an admission that the tactical initiative had passed to the enemy, that his mission had devolved from attack to survival. Around him, the battle for Normandy continued, the thunder of naval guns, the roar of aircraft, the rattle of small arms fire from a dozen directions. The coherent defensive plan that had existed 12 hours earlier had shattered into fragments, and each fragment faced its own isolated struggle. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The prisoners continued arriving throughout the afternoon and evening of the 6th of June. American paratroopers, captured in small groups or individually, men who had been separated from their units during the jump and wandered through the Norman countryside until encountering German patrols. Von der Heydt interviewed several personally, seeking to understand not just their tactical situation but their thinking, their psychology. One prisoner, a lieutenant from the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment, proved more talkative than most. His name was Robert Murphy, and he had broken his ankle during the jump, landing in a tree near the village of Angovilla Plain. German troops found him 12 hours later, still tangled in his parachute harness, his equipment scattered in the field below. "You trained for this operation," von der Heydt said, stating facts rather than asking a question. They sat in what had been the farmhouse kitchen, Murphy's injured leg propped on a chair, a German medic having already fixed the fracture. "For 6 months," Murphy replied. "We built mock-ups of every objective in England. Practiced the jump, the assembly, the attack. We knew the plan backwards and backwards. And yet you jumped at night, scattered across kilometers of territory, with no guarantee you would find your unit or your objectives." Murphy shrugged, wincing at the pain the movement caused. "That was part of the plan too. We trained for dispersion. Every man knew multiple objectives, multiple assembly points. If you couldn't reach your primary, you went for the secondary. If you couldn't find your unit, you joined whoever you found first. That's chaos," von der Heydt said. "Not tactics." "Maybe," Murphy conceded. "But chaos works when you've got 12,000 men creating it simultaneously. You can't fight chaos with organization, Major. Chaos wins." The lieutenant's words stayed with von der Heydt long after the interview ended. Chaos works when you've got 12,000 men creating it simultaneously. It was an inversion of everything the German military believed about warfare. Order, discipline, precise execution of well-rehearsed plans, these were the foundations of German tactical doctrine. But the Americans had embraced disorder, had trained for it, had made it their weapon. And they had the industrial capacity to make disorder work. That was the crucial factor von der Heydt recognized as the battle entered its second day. The Allies could afford to scatter 12,000 men across the Cotentin Peninsula because they had 12,000 men to scatter. They could afford aircraft losses because they could replace the aircraft. They could accept the inefficiency of airborne operations because efficiency, in the American conception of warfare, meant overwhelming the enemy with resources rather than outsmarting them with tactics. The German army in Normandy, by contrast, operated on the edge of sustainability. Every casualty mattered. Every tank destroyed represented an irreplaceable loss. Every gallon of fuel consumed brought them closer to immobility. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of European skies, could barely contest Allied air superiority. The Kriegsmarine's surface fleet remained bottled up in ports, unable to challenge the invasion fleet. Germany fought with the army it had, and that army was shrinking. Von der Heydt's regiment numbered approximately 1,800 men on the morning of the 6th of June. By the evening of the 7th, his effective strength had fallen to fewer than 1,400. Not all were casualties, some units had become isolated, cut off by American positions, unable to rejoin the regiment. But the trend was clear. His force was eroding while American strength grew with each hour as more troops landed on Utah Beach and pushed inland. The psychological impact of the airborne assault extended beyond the immediate tactical situation. German troops throughout Normandy reported seeing parachutes, hearing aircraft, encountering enemy soldiers in areas supposedly secure. Some reports were accurate. Others reflected the fog of war, the tendency of stressed men to interpret ambiguous stimuli as threats. But accurate or not, the reports created an atmosphere of uncertainty that undermined defensive cohesion. A German infantryman guarding a crossroads 5 kilometers behind the front line could no longer assume he was safe. The enemy might literally fall from the sky. Rear area units, which in previous campaigns had enjoyed relative security, now faced the same dangers as frontline troops. The entire German defensive zone became a potential battlefield, and no position could be considered secure. This was the strategic purpose of the airborne operation, von der Heydt came to understand. Not to seize and hold specific terrain, though they did that, but to shatter German assumptions about where and how the battle would be fought. By landing behind the coastal defenses, the Allies had bypassed the Atlantic Wall's strongest fortifications, forcing German commanders to fight on multiple fronts simultaneously, never certain where the next threat would emerge. The third day of the invasion brought rain, heavy gray curtains that reduced visibility and turned Norman roads into rivers of mud. Von der Heydt's regiment held defensive positions north of St. Mary-Glees, engaging American forces that pressed steadily inland. The tactical situation had stabilized in the sense that positions were clear, Germans here, Americans there, but stability meant containment, not success. His regiment contained nothing. The Americans expanded their perimeter daily, bringing up reinforcements and supplies, consolidating their hold on the causeways and villages they had seized during the first chaotic hours. Allied air superiority, which German planning had acknowledged as a problem, proved to be an insurmountable obstacle. Aircraft, fighters, bombers, fighter-bombers, roamed over Normandy at will, attacking any German unit that revealed itself. Von der Heydt's men learned to move only at night, to camouflage positions with obsessive care, to recognize the distinctive sound of Allied aircraft and freeze at its approach. During daylight hours, the regiment existed in a state of enforced immobility, watching American forces maneuver freely while German responses remained paralyzed by the threat from above. On the 8th of June, von der Heydt received orders to withdraw his regiment to new positions farther from the coast. The order acknowledged what had become obvious to every German soldier in Normandy: the invasion had succeeded. The Allies had established a lodgment that could not be dislodged. The only question now was whether German forces could contain the breakout that would inevitably follow. His regiment pulled back through the rain, leaving behind the positions they had fought to hold for 3 days. American paratroopers, those men who had fallen from the sky on the night of the 6th, occupied the villages and crossroads von der Heydt's men abandoned. They had won. Not through superior tactics or better training, but through the simple arithmetic of overwhelming force applied in overwhelming numbers before the Germans could organize an effective response. The withdrawal gave von der Heydt time to reflect on what had happened, to analyze the airborne operation from a professional perspective stripped of immediate tactical concerns. The Allies had dropped approximately 13,000 men in approximately 3 hours over the Norman Peninsula. Of those, perhaps 10,000 had landed in condition to fight, the rest killed in the jump, injured, or captured before they could reach their units. Those 10,000, scattered and disorganized, had nonetheless accomplished their mission. They had seized key terrain, blocked German reinforcements, and held long enough for the seaborne invasion to establish itself. The casualty rate among Allied paratroopers was significant. Von der Heydt estimated 20 to 30%, similar to Crete. But unlike Crete, the Allies had anticipated these losses, had planned for them, and had accepted them as the price of strategic success. They had calculated that the chaos created by dropping 13,000 men behind German lines would outweigh the cost of losing 3,000 to death, injury, or capture. And they were correct. The intelligence reports arriving at German headquarters in the days following the invasion told a story that professional soldiers found difficult to accept. The Allied airborne operation had employed 1,200 transport aircraft and gliders. They had flown multiple missions, some aircraft making 2 trips across the channel on the night of the 5th and 6th of June. The logistical coordination required to launch this armada, to brief the crews, load the paratroopers, time the takeoff so that aircraft from dozens of airfields arrived over Normandy in synchronized waves, exceeded anything the German military could have managed at this stage of the war. Von der Heydt compiled his own after-action report during the regiment's brief rest period in mid-June. He wrote with the precision of a man trained to extract lessons from defeat, but his analysis carried an undercurrent of something approaching awe. The Americans had not simply executed a large airborne operation. They had fundamentally reimagined what airborne operations could accomplish. The German conception of parachute assault emphasized precision. Small units dropped on specific objectives, achieving surprise through speed and audacity. The Allied approach at Normandy embraced imprecision, understanding that when you dropped enough men over a wide enough area, statistical probability ensured that sufficient numbers would land near enough to their objectives to accomplish the mission. Individual units might fail. Individual soldiers might die in a jump or land kilometers from where they intended. But the collective force, the aggregate of thousands of scattered men, would coalesce into an effective fighting formation. It was warfare as mass production, von der Heydt realized. The same industrial philosophy that allowed American factories to produce ships and aircraft and tanks in numbers that defied German comprehension had been applied to tactics. Quality mattered less than quantity. Precision mattered less than volume. The Americans had calculated that dropping 13,000 men, even poorly, even with significant casualties, would achieve better results than dropping 3,000 men perfectly. And their calculation had proven correct. By the 15th of June, Allied forces had linked their beachheads into a continuous front stretching across Normandy. The airborne divisions, having accomplished their initial objectives, now fought as conventional infantry, holding sectors of the line while fresh divisions poured ashore. The 101st and 82nd Airborne, those units that had fallen from the sky 9 days earlier, remained in combat, exhausted but effective, their casualties mounting as the battle ground on. Von der Heydt's regiment engaged elements of the 82nd Airborne throughout mid-June, fighting for control of villages whose names meant nothing to anyone beyond Norman farmers but whose possession determined the pace of Allied advance. The Americans he faced now bore little resemblance to the scattered, disorganized paratroopers of the first night. They had consolidated, resupplied, integrated with supporting arms. They fought with the confidence of men who had survived the chaos of the jump and discovered they could survive anything. In late June, during a brief lull in combat operations, von der Heydt had an encounter that crystallized his understanding of what had changed in modern warfare. His men captured an American captain, a company commander from the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment who had been wounded during a failed attack on German positions near the village of Grains. The captain's name was Charles Johnson, and he had jumped on the night of the 6th, landing in the marshes south of Corentin, 3 kilometers from his designated drop zone. They met in the aid station where German medics treated both German and American wounded, the ethics of battlefield medicine temporarily overriding the imperatives of combat. Johnson's shoulder had been shattered by shell fragments, his left arm immobilized in a sling. Von der Heydt, recognizing the American's rank in regiment, requested permission to speak with him. Johnson, sedated but conscious, agreed. "You jumped that night," von der Heydt said, sitting beside the captain's cot. "I did. Into the marshes." "Not intentionally," Johnson replied with a slight smile. "The wind took us off course. Landed in water up to my chest. I lost half my equipment." "How long before you reached your unit?" 14 hours. "I found about 30 men from my company by dawn. 40 more by noon. We had maybe half our strength when we went into action." Von der Heydt nodded. "And yet you attacked." "That was the mission." The major leaned forward slightly. "Captain Johnson, I must ask you something. You are a professional soldier, yes? Do you understand tactics?" "I'd like to think so." "Then explain to me why your commanders believed this operation would succeed. You dropped thousands of men at night, over unfamiliar terrain, with predictable dispersion and casualties. By every tactical principle, it should have been a disaster. We studied Crete. We learned the lessons. How did your side reach a different conclusion?" Johnson was quiet for a moment, his eyes focused on something beyond the aid station's canvas walls. When he spoke, his voice carried the weariness of a man who had spent 3 weeks in continuous combat. "We didn't reach a different conclusion, Major. We reached the same conclusion you did. Airborne operations are costly, chaotic, and inefficient. The difference is, we could afford it." "Afford it," von der Heydt repeated. "We have the aircraft. We have the men. We have the industrial capacity to replace our losses and keep fighting. You don't. That's not tactics, Major. That's arithmetic. The simplicity of the answer was damning. Johnson was not boasting. He was stating a fact that both men understood. The United States could accept casualties that would cripple Germany because American strength was not measured in what they had but in what they could produce. The 13,000 paratroopers dropped on Normandy represented not the limit of American airborne capability but a fraction of it. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions were two of 5 such formations the Americans had trained. If these 2 divisions were destroyed, 3 more could take their place. Germany, by contrast, fought with finite resources that diminished with every battle. Von der Heydt's regiment, reduced to fewer than 1,200 effectives by late June, could not be replaced. The men who had died in the Norman hedgerows represented years of training, combat experience that could not be quickly recreated. When a German parachute regiment was destroyed, it stayed destroyed. There's something else, Johnson added, his voice dropping slightly. We believed in it. Every man who jumped that night knew the risks, knew the plan was chaos. But we believed it would work because we'd trained for it, because our commanders believed in it, and because we'd seen what American industry could do. When you know your side has 50,000 aircraft and the enemy has 500, you start thinking differently about acceptable losses. The number Johnson cited, 50,000 aircraft, was impossible. Surely an exaggeration. But even if the true figure was half that, even a quarter, the implication remained devastating. The Allies possessed military resources on a scale that invalidated traditional calculations of what was strategically feasible. Von der Heydt thanked the captain for his candor and left the aid station. Outside, the Norman summer continued its progression toward harvest season, the fields around grains green with crops that would rot unharvested as the battle consumed the countryside. In the distance, artillery rumbled, the background noise of modern war, constant and meaningless in its constancy. The Major understood now what had happened on the night of the 6th of June. The Allies had not defeated German tactical doctrine through superior planning or execution. They had rendered German doctrine irrelevant through the application of resources so vast that efficiency ceased to matter. When you could afford to waste an entire airborne division on a diversionary attack, when you could drop 13,000 men knowing that 3,000 would become casualties and still consider it a success, you had entered a new era of warfare, one where victory belonged not to the most skilled but to the most productive. The German army in Normandy continued fighting through June and into July, contesting every village, every hedgerow, every meter of Norman soil. Von der Heydt's regiment participated in the desperate battles around St. Lo, watching as Allied numerical superiority ground German defenses into fragments. The 82nd Airborne Division, those men who had jumped into chaos on the night of the 6th, fought alongside infantry divisions in the breakout from the beachhead, their elite status now secondary to their function as another formation in an army that measured strength in divisions rather than regiments. By August, when Allied forces finally broke through German lines at Avranches and poured into Brittany, von der Heydt had lost count of how many of his original regiment remained. Perhaps 400 men. Perhaps fewer. They had been fighting continuously for 9 weeks, and the attrition showed in their faces, their movements, the mechanical way they performed tasks that had once required thought. The Major was evacuated from Normandy in mid-August, his regiment too depleted to remain effective. He carried with him memories of the night the sky fell, of parachutes drifting through darkness in numbers that defied belief. Those images would remain vivid for the rest of his life, sharper, in some ways, than memories of Crete or Russia or any other battle he had fought. In September of 1944, Friedrich von der Heydt wrote a lengthy analysis of Allied airborne operations for the Wehrmacht's Tactical Review Board. His report examined the Normandy drops in detail, comparing them to German experiences in Crete and Allied operations in Sicily and Italy. His conclusions were stark: large-scale airborne assault remained costly and chaotic, but when supported by overwhelming air superiority, massive logistical resources, and the willingness to accept significant casualties in pursuit of strategic objectives, such operations could achieve results that smaller, more precise insertions could not. He noted that the Allies had learned from Crete, but they had learned different lessons than the Germans. Where German doctrine concluded that airborne operations must be limited in scale to minimize casualties, Allied doctrine concluded that casualties could be minimized through scale itself. Drop enough men and the dispersion becomes insignificant. Accept enough losses and the operation succeeds through sheer numerical advantage. Von der Heydt's report circulated through Wehrmacht headquarters in the fall of 1944, but by then, the question of airborne operations had become academic. Germany lacked the aircraft, the fuel, and the trained parachutists to conduct operations on any significant scale. The Luftwaffe's transport fleet had been decimated. The surviving Fallschirmjäger fought as ground infantry, their specialized training preserved for a form of warfare Germany could no longer wage. The Major's final airborne operation came in December of 1944, during the Ardennes Offensive, the Battle of the Bulge. He commanded a parachute drop of approximately 1,000 men ahead of German armored columns, an attempt to seize key crossroads and disrupt Allied communications. The operation, condemned Operation Stasser, demonstrated everything von der Heydt had written about in his September report: insufficient aircraft, poor coordination, scattered drops, high casualties, and ultimately, failure to achieve objectives. Of the 1,000 men who jumped on the night of December 16, perhaps 300 ever reached the designated assembly area. The rest landed scattered across the Belgian countryside, were captured, killed, or simply vanished into the winter darkness. Von der Heydt himself was captured by American forces on December 21, ending his war in circumstances that carried a certain ironic symmetry. The German parachute commander who had witnessed the Allied airborne invasion of Normandy now became a prisoner of the same army whose tactics he had analyzed and grudgingly admired. In captivity, von der Heydt had time to reflect on what the Normandy drops had represented. They were not simply a tactical innovation but a demonstration of industrial-age warfare's fundamental logic. The side with greater production capacity could afford strategies that the resource-poor could not. The Americans had dropped 13,000 men in 3 hours not because they were reckless but because they could afford to be. Their industrial base could absorb losses that would bankrupt a European power. Their training infrastructure could replace casualties faster than combat could inflict them. This was the lesson of Normandy, von der Heydt concluded. Not that airborne operations had become more effective, but that the nature of warfare itself had changed. Victory no longer belonged to the army with the best tactics or the most experienced soldiers. Victory belonged to the nation that could produce more ships, more aircraft, more tanks, more ammunition than its enemy could destroy. Skill mattered, certainly. Training mattered. But in the calculus of modern war, industrial capacity mattered more. The German officers who had never expected paratroopers dropping 13,000 men behind their lines in 3 hours had made an error not of intelligence but of imagination. They had failed to imagine that any nation would commit resources on such a scale to a single operation. They had failed to imagine that American commanders would accept the casualties inherent in massive airborne assault because they could not imagine the industrial system that made such casualties sustainable. In the years after the war, von der Heydt wrote extensively about his experiences, contributing to military journals and academic studies of airborne operations. He returned to civilian life, became a professor of law, and lived into his 80s. But the night of June 6, 1944, remained the pivotal moment in his understanding of warfare. The night when he stood in a Norman farmyard and watched the sky fill with parachutes, watched an army fall from darkness, watched his assumptions about what was possible in war shatter against the reality of American industrial power. The men who jumped that night, the American paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne, the British paratroopers of the 6th Airborne, paid the price von der Heydt had anticipated. Approximately 2,500 became casualties in the first 48 hours, killed or wounded in the jump or the fighting that followed. Their sacrifice was not meaningless, but neither was it efficient. They succeeded not through tactical brilliance but through the brutal arithmetic of overwhelming force. The German defenders fought as they had been trained to fight, with skill and discipline and tactical sophistication honed through years of combat experience. They inflicted casualties. They contested every objective. They made the Allies pay for every village, every causeway, every hedgerow. But in the end, German tactical excellence could not overcome Allied material superiority. The battle for Normandy was decided not in the Norman fields but in the factories of Detroit and Pittsburgh, where workers who would never see combat produced the aircraft that carried 13,000 men across the Channel and the weapons that kept them supplied for the weeks of fighting that followed. The telephone that rang at 23 minutes past midnight on June 6, 1944, had delivered news that seemed impossible. The sky was full of parachutes. In the hours and days that followed, Friedrich von der Heydt learned that the impossible had become routine, that the age of limited warfare waged with scarce resources had ended, that the future belonged to nations whose industrial capacity allowed them to approach war as a problem of production rather than strategy. He had witnessed the beginning of that future falling through the Norman darkness, white canopies drifting down like snow in summer, thousands of them, more than he could count, more than his experience had prepared him to face. The German officers had never expected it because their entire framework for understanding warfare could not accommodate it. And in their failure of imagination lay the seeds of defeat, planted on a June night when the sky fell and 13,000 men landed behind the Atlantic Wall in 3 hours, changing forever the calculus of what was possible in modern war. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.